All right, well, welcome back to Bio 1. Today we're going to talk about the different kinds of living things that we might come across in this class. And we'll also cover things that are what we call semi-living or partially living, and I'll explain that as we get to it. But particularly like when we're talking about viruses and these prions here, I see I covered up my P there. We'll talk about these and why we call them semi-living and partially living, particularly the viruses. Prions are very much non-living because they're just infectious protein particles. But first we'll talk about, when we talk about living things, we talk about cells. So as you might remember from the beginning of week 1, that anything that's alive is made up of a cell. And cells come in two sort of categories, eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. And eukaryotic cells are those that have a nucleus, and they include things such as plants are a type of eukaryotic cell, or plants are made out of eukaryotic cells, animals such as humans. All right, and actually most of the things you know about are made up of eukaryotic cells. This would also include plants, animals, a fungus like a mushroom, for example, fungi, and several others. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, and the thing you're probably most familiar with, it's a prokaryotic cell, is a bacteria. So bacteria are made up of prokaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, plants, animals, fungi, most of the things you know about that are large that you can see without a microscope, and some of these are even microscopic in size. But anything certainly that's large that you can see without a microscope that's alive, it's almost always a eukaryotic type of organism. And a prokaryotic type of organism is, again, most familiar thing you know about. We'll talk about others though, bacteria. Okay, so we'll go through these and we'll talk about first eukaryotic cells, and we'll hit a couple of these here and talk about them. So eukaryotic cells, again, have a nucleus. So here's our typical eukaryotic cell. You notice there's the nucleus right there. And again, the nucleus is important because inside the nucleus you'll find DNA, and DNA is used to code for proteins. So in a cell like ours, that's where you'd find the DNA, or one of the places. Bacteria also have DNA, but it's sort of scattered around here loose inside this area here. So inside the nucleus is where you find the DNA in a eukaryotic cell. There are other organelles we'll mention, like the mitochondria here, the endoplasmic reticulum. These are all things you find in a eukaryotic cell that you don't typically find in a prokaryotic cell. So we'll go through them, and throughout the weeks we'll actually talk about them more. So animals are a type of eukaryotic organism. Plants, so plants made out of eukaryotic cells. Fungi. This other group here, protozoans. This is sort of a group that people argue on how you describe it, but for this particular class, what we'll talk about them is being these single-celled, for the most part, eukaryotic organisms. So there are several examples of pathogens, for example, diseases that humans can get. One of them is Plasmodium vivax, and that is a protozoan. So that's a eukaryotic organism that you would get primarily in like parts of Africa, where you get bit by a mosquito, and the mosquito then transmits this plasmodium into your bloodstream, and you develop the disease called malaria. Globally, this is one of the largest, most deadly diseases in the world, is malaria. Similar to that, also different organism, bit by a different organism, but is this Trypanosoma brucei, also a protozoan, and that causes African sleeping sickness that you might have heard of before. So these are diseases that are caused by organisms that are not bacteria, but instead they're protozoans, which means they're made out of eukaryotic cells. So we'll go through and sort of take a little tour of the cell here, talk about the mitochondria first. The mitochondria, often referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. So here's a mitochondria here, and what you find is that in cells that are utilizing a great deal of energy, what mitochondria do is they, and we'll go into detail on this in about a couple of weeks, they take the food you eat and basically can alter the food or change the food, not create, but change the food at least somewhat into energy that the cell can use to grow and divide and things like that. So the mitochondria, we call them the powerhouse of the cell because of their ability to alter the food we eat, at least somewhat of the food we eat, into a source of energy that can be used by the cell. Okay, we'll talk about that later on. Chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are found not in our cells particularly, but if you have a plant cell, which again is a type of a eukaryotic cell, and that's what you see here in this picture. The chloroplast seen here, we'll go into detail on this in another week as well, a couple weeks as well. The chloroplasts are a type of energy exchange bank. What they do basically is through a series of reactions, they take light plus some other stuff we'll mention, and they basically can make food or alter food. So they take the light energy plus carbon dioxide from the air, and with a series of reactions we'll talk about later on called photosynthesis, plants can produce essentially their own food from that. They're photosynthetic. There are bacteria that do this as well. They don't have chloroplasts, but they have similar enzymes that they use to do it. Then we have ribosomes. Ribosomes are found in different spots. They're usually sort of tiny. You can see in here they're not very big or obvious at this point. Sometimes you'll see them also attached to this endoplasmic reticulum. We'll mention those later on as well. But what ribosomes are used for, ribosomes are used to make proteins. So we'll talk about how the DNA later on is used as the code, and the ribosomes sort of allow all that to get together and are used for making protein. You find ribosomes both in prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. They're slightly different in size. They do the same kind of thing in terms of making protein, but because they're slightly different, this is one of the targets if you have a bacterial infection, because the ribosomes are different. There are drugs designed that will block the ribosomes of prokaryotic cells but will not hurt our cells. Okay, here's just a sort of a close-up of the mitochondria. Right now we don't need to worry about it too much because we'll go into more detail on this later on, but you'll notice that just for now that the mitochondria actually has sort of two membranes to it. There's one there, and that's the outer membrane, and then there's this inner membrane, and the inner membrane has these folds in it that go like that. Those are called the cristae, folds in and out like that. So the outer membrane and the inner membrane, and then the matrix is this part in the center of that. And for now, the fact that you know there's two membranes and that there's this inner matrix and these fold called the cristae, that's good for now. Later on we'll talk about what goes on in those areas when we talk about how the cell will actually take the food you eat and alter that into an energy source, into ATP. So we'll get to that later on. Once again, here's the chloroplast, and you'll notice a similar kind of thing. We have an outer membrane and we have an inner membrane, and then we'll mention these little, they look like, I always think they look like little junior mints, you know, that you eat when you go to the movie theater or whatever. These little junior mints all stacked up, and we'll talk about those, and we'll talk about these, they're called thylakoids, and we'll talk about how they are used for a process called photosynthesis that, as I mentioned, is used to produce food, in a sense, using light and carbon dioxide, which is kind of cool. We'll talk about that. So a couple other things in our tour of the cell, a couple other things are important. Once again, the nucleus, that's the brain of the cell. So you can see that right there. There's the nucleus. It also has a membrane and has the DNA inside of it. We have the endoplasmic reticulum, which comes in two types. You can see this one right here. There's some endoplasmic reticulum, and then you can see some right here. So we have sort of two different types. We have what's called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. It has ribosomes attached to it. It looks rough. When you look at it under a microscope, that's how it gets its name, because it's bumpy because of the ribosomes, and it's used for protein processing. So sometimes as proteins are made, here they will go through the ER and they'll get altered and changed a little bit, and then they will be slightly different than if they were made, say, out here in the cytoplasm, which is the area between the nucleus and the cell membrane. Then we have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and that's usually, as you can see right here, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum is used for making lipids. Okay, so fats and things like that. Remember the phospholipid bilayer right here? Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. That's used for the cell membrane for regulating what moves in and out of the cell. And also the smooth endoplasmic reticulum is important for detoxification. So the breakdown of certain chemicals that are harsh on the body. So you find a lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum in, say, the cells of the liver, which are important for breaking down harmful chemicals that you might eat. The Golgi apparatus, that's right in here. As you can see here, the Golgi apparatus, or Golgi complex, as it's sometimes called, that's a sorting and shipping sort of function. And so what happens is there are some proteins that are going to be made that are designed to stay inside this cell, but then there are other proteins that are going to come out of the cell and travel to other cells, for example, or they're going to work on the outside of the cell. So the Golgi apparatus is designed to sort of assist the movement of molecules in a direction, whether they're going to go in the cell or out of the cell. And then sometimes you can see scattered throughout here are these little sort of sacs that are called lysosomes. And a lysosome is basically a bag of enzymes, and those are used for digestion. So a lot of times bacteria, for example, will get engulfed into this area here. So you might have a white blood cell that will engulf these, and then what will happen is a lysosome is designed to sort of break those down. It'll fuse together and it will digest those. Don't typically find those in plant cells, but we do in animal cells. Centriole, you don't need to worry about that right now. That's used for cell division. You also don't have those in plant cells. We will talk about those in week 8, I believe it is, 7 or 8. And then a flagellum. A flagellum is used for movement. And if you think about say a sperm, a human sperm, for example, a flagella is used for swimming. There are other organisms and things that have a flagella, but that's what that looks like there. In this case here, we have a plant cell, which again is a eukaryotic organism, and they have a cell membrane which regulates what moves in and out of the cell. We'll talk about that more. Whether you have a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell, all cells have a cell membrane. Okay, so anything that's alive, any type of cell, although they can be different from one another, they all have a cell membrane. They all can regulate somewhat what moves in and out of the cell. Some animals, or some organisms, I should say, also have outside of the cell membrane a separate structure called a cell wall, and the cell wall is used for protection. So in plants, the cell wall is made out of cellulose. Animals do not have a cell wall. So once again, humans are animals, and we do not have cell walls. Plants have cell walls. Fungi have cell walls, but it's not made out of cellulose. It's made out of something different. And bacteria, which are prokaryotic, usually have a cell wall also, but it's made out of a different chemical. So plants, which are eukaryotic, have a cell wall, and a large component of that, or an important component of that, is cellulose. And if you remember what type of macromolecule is cellulose, if you can remember that, it is a polysaccharide. If you remember that, that's the big carbohydrates. Okay. Also, throughout the cell are these things called, there's all kinds of like scaffolding. I don't know if you've ever seen them build, say, a highway or a freeway bridge. And of course, it's made out of concrete. Well, if you just make it out of solid concrete and it moves or twists, it'll break. So throughout structures like an overpass on a freeway, throughout there's all this metal rebar stuff to help it sort of flex, to have a little bit of flex to it. And you find the same thing in a cell. So throughout the cell, there's what we call the cytoskeleton. There's all these protein fibers that run throughout it, and they come in sort of three different sizes. We can talk about microfilaments, intermediate filaments, and microtubules. I only mention them here now, for two reasons. One, we're going to talk about them being the scaffolding or the cytoskeleton going through here and sort of just giving some structure and organization and giving it a certain shape. But they also have other functions in terms of moving things around. And later on, when we get to talking about cell division, we'll talk about how these microtubules are used to separate certain parts of the cell. So for now, those are the three different sizes of macromolecules. Three different sizes of the cytoskeleton proteins. And then we get to prokaryotic cells. And once again, prokaryotic cells are those that lack a nucleus. They also lack most other organelles. So they are much smaller in size. So you can see here's a typical prokaryotic cell here. And what you still have DNA, and the DNA is just located in the center here. So there's no mitochondria. In fact, this is the size, the typical bacteria is actually the size of a mitochondria or a chloroplast. So they're much, much, much smaller. They're more the size of an organelle than anything. And then bacteria tend to have one big singular chromosome in the middle here, so they'll call that the nucleoid region, and that's where the DNA is. There can be other sources of DNA that we might mention later on. And you'll notice also in here, this is where the ribosomes are. So they do have ribosomes, and they can make their own proteins. You notice that they have a plasma membrane as well. Remember, the plasma membrane and the cell membrane, essentially the same thing. Okay, and then outside the cell membrane, some organisms, such as most bacteria, also have a cell wall. It's made out of a different polysaccharide that we'll call peptidoglycan. So slightly different chemically than what you find in plant cells. So peptidoglycan. And there are many different types of bacteria. These are some ones you're probably familiar with. Escherichia coli or E. coli. That's a digestive tract organism. You find out every now and then about these outbreaks of E. coli or in contaminated water. It's basically a fecal bacteria. So if you get an E. coli infection, typically it has something to do with you being exposed to what they call fecal coliform bacteria. Someone used a restroom and they didn't wash their hands really good, and you get it that way, for example. We also have E. coli just living in our digestive tract, and I should mention that although most of the time we talk about how bad bacteria are, for the most part, most bacteria are beneficial or they're not harmful to us. So 90% or more of the bacteria actually benefit us, although we don't usually focus on that, but it's true. Salmonella is another type of bacteria. You can get this from reptiles as an infection. Most people associate that with chicken. You can, undercooked chicken and so forth, or you can also get it from eggs. Many different sources, actually, to pick up salmonella. Most people think about it being a chicken-related issue. And then we have tuberculosis. This is a lung infection. Worldwide, this is still a really, really big problem. Worldwide, lots of people dying from tuberculosis. And recently, fairly recently, there's been sort of these new strains of tuberculosis that are resistant to drugs because we've overexposed people to antibiotics. And so we have these now multiple strain resistant multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis strains that are very difficult to treat now. Even here in the United States, people will get tuberculosis now that becomes very difficult to treat because it's so immune to our antibiotics. And then you can't really go without mentioning Yersinia pestis, which is the bacteria that is responsible for causing bubonic plague. Historically, not now, but historically, this has been a major factor in, say, Shakespearean times and in other periods of time where literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people died from this infection. Now with our antibiotics, it's quite treatable if you have access to that. So you don't see outbreaks like that anymore like we used to in the past. Then another group, really a separate group altogether, is what we call the archaea. And we used to refer to these as the ancient bacteria. They are prokaryotic, but now we're starting to rethink that and have been for actually quite a while now, and think that they're not ancient really. They might even be more closely related to eukaryotic cells, but they are not bacteria. They are prokaryotic, but they are slightly different. And when you think about the archaea, they usually live in extreme environments. So we'll often refer to these as extremophiles. Extremophiles. So if you go to the bottom of the ocean, there's these hydrothermal vents with like this boiling water coming up, and you'll have the archaea living down right in there amongst the heat of that. So that's a separate group of organisms called the archaea. They are prokaryotic, but they themselves are not bacteria. And then we'll go on. We'll talk about viruses, and I mentioned how these are semi-living. We talk about viruses as being semi-living, and by semi-living, what I mean by that is there's certain characteristics that living things have to do that they can do. They can reproduce. They have to consume energy. They use energy up. They can reproduce. They can use energy. They are capable of moving and growing, and there's a whole bunch of things you have to do in order to truly be alive. Well, viruses can't really survive or do all the things that a living thing can do, so we often refer to them as semi-living or partially living. And so what happens is viruses, what they do in order to operate is they take over a host cell. So for example, HIV out on its own can't really do anything. But once it gets inside your body, for example, it can infect your cells, and then it can reproduce using the machinery and the energy essentially of your cells to reproduce. And HIV, as you know, is related to causing the disease called AIDS. So HIV is the name of the virus. And if you have HIV and it progresses after a certain point, you're diagnosed with the disease called AIDS. And worldwide, this is a very large number of people are dying from AIDS, and particularly in developing countries, Africa, Russia, places like that. And essentially a virus is a nucleic acid that's wrapped up in a protein. So DNA, for example, or it could be RNA, and it can come in different types. You can have single-stranded DNA, double-stranded DNA, you can have double-stranded RNA. So there's a lot of variation on this, but it's either DNA or RNA, and then that's wrapped up in a protein coat. And so this is an example here you can see of a virus with its DNA on the inside. But once again, it has to take over a host cell before it can actually reproduce. Influenza, worldwide, globally, historically, this is probably the biggest killer of all times in terms of infectious diseases. To give you an example, back in the 1918s and 1919s, there was an epidemic outbreak they often call the Spanish flu. And so every now and then there's these pandemic. Pandemic is a worldwide outbreak of a disease, so a pandemic disease. And so in the case of influenza, they think somewhere between 50 and maybe, even 100 million people died in this one 18-month period of influenza. And that's a lot of people. I mean, you're talking about, 100 million people right now. If you think about things like HIV and some of the big global killers, most of those, HIV, malaria, and starvation, those are somewhere usually around 10 million people dying per year, which is a lot. So 100 million people, particularly back at this point in time, when there was only probably maybe, around 2 billion people on the planet. That's a lot of people. Now with 7 billion people on the planet, our big diseases are killing, 10 million people. So that the flu at that time was a big deal. The flu on a normal year, even in the United States, is a pretty big deal and kills 20, 30, 40,000 people at any given time. So influenza, a virus, it's globally related to the flu, a big deal. A lot of people have died from it, and still a big deal. Polio is another one. Polio causes paralysis. And paralysis of leg muscles or arm, often on one side of the body. It can also paralyze, though, your nerves, your neurons that go to your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is important for breathing, and so you can die from polio because it can make it to where you can't breathe anymore. And then another virus you probably heard about is hepatitis. Hepatitis comes in different types. Hepatitis A, B, and C, and there's actually other ones other than that. Hepatitis A is a virus that you get mainly from eating, like E. coli, food or water that's been contaminated. You get this in restaurants. And there's hot spots, and California happens to be a hot spot where a lot of people end up getting hepatitis A infections. You rarely die from hepatitis A infections, but you might wish you died because you get so deathly sick sometimes. But usually that's treatable. B and C, on the other hand, these are blood or sexually transmitted types of pathogens, and these ultimately cause liver damage. And these are fatal if untreated and are chronic infections that become a problem for a long period of time. And then as our last group of sort of pathogens or things, we'll talk about these prions. And prions are infectious protein particles. And there's very few of them. We don't know tremendously that much about them. But what we think happens is there are certain proteins that what they do is when they come into contact with other proteins, they alter them or change them into this prion state. And so what happens is a prion disease is one in which there's some damaged proteins, usually in your nervous system or in your brain, part of your nervous system, and they alter or they change proteins into this damaging type or this damaging state. And you've heard probably of some of these, such as mad cow disease. There was an outbreak several years ago, and basically these cows develop mad cow disease, and what happens is they develop this neurological problem. And if you eat a cow with mad cow disease, you develop similar types of conditions. And one of those is what they call CJD, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. That's a fun one to say, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And so what happens is this is a neurological disorder that people develop if they eat prions. Also, it turns out that that there's a there's a small chance, it's rare, but you can actually have this genetically predisposed to it where your proteins will just sort of automatically convert to that. But again, it's very rare. And what ends up happening is it causes, as your proteins get altered and changed, it ends up causing neurological nerve damage. And eventually you're going to die from the lack of brain control, kind of like what can happen with Alzheimer's in terms of damaging neurons. Kuru is another type. Probably haven't heard of this one. Maybe you've had anthropology. But what happens is, in certain places in the world, like in Papua New Guinea, there's a disease called Kuru, in which people, as part of their religious culture, when someone dies, they will ingest or eat part of their family member, for example. And those people that eat primarily brain and nervous tissue can develop this disease called Kuru, which is essentially like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a neurological disorder of the brain. So these are very, very, very tough to treat. There's another interesting one that is very, very rare. It's called fatal familial insomnia. So what happens here in fatal familial insomnia is it's fatal, first of all. Familial, which means it's inherited. And then insomnia, you know about. Insomnia is the inability to sleep. And a lot of people suffer from insomnia, difficulty sleeping. But in this very, very rare case, like very rare, I'm talking about there's been like, I think something like 4 to 7 cases in history. So there's very, very few of them related to this one family. And I believe they're from Italy. Is where they're traced back to. But anyway, what happens is these people have this prion disorder. It's genetic, and what happens is they have difficulty going to sleep as they get older, more and more difficulty, and eventually they get to a point where they can't go to sleep anymore. And we just recently discovered, not too long ago, I think it actually came out in 2012, that one of the functions of sleep is it's necessary to remove a buildup of brain toxins. So if you don't go to sleep and you prolong sleep and you do that over and over again, you end up damaging your brain because of the buildup of toxins. And so this fatal familial insomnia is one of those. If you're all freaking out because you can't sleep tonight and that kind of thing, realize there's only been 4 to 7 cases throughout history, and so you probably don't have that. So don't worry about that. A lot of people have insomnia just because they can't sleep. They're stressed out or whatever. So don't go thinking you have fatal familial insomnia. Okay, I think that'll be good for now.